Hello class, welcome to week 4 of Programming Logic with Python. So this week we're going to cover functions, like what are functions, why would we use functions, etc. Before I get into that, I do want to congratulate you guys on reaching the midway point of this semester. Typically this course is covered over a 15-week period for like the spring or fall semester. So the fact that you guys are learning these heavy topics in 1 week intervals is very impressive. Most of you guys have completed most of the homework assignments and submitted them, and you guys have done really well on them. So I do want to congratulate you guys on that. So getting back to week 4, this video is going to be kind of cut up into 2 separate parts. The first part is going to be me explaining what functions are, how to use them, how to call them, etc. The second part is going to be me going over one of the homework assignments for week 4. Specifically, it's Module Lab Assessment 4, I believe, where we kind of work with, I believe it was like interest rates and stuff like that. So I'll go over that. I'm not going to complete the assignment for you, but I will kind of guide you guys on the correct steps on how to approach the assignment. So let's kind of get into functions. So at its core, functions are basically ways for us to save our lines of code inside of a umbrella of sorts. So I can write maybe like 3 print statements, such as this very top part of my Visual Studio. So I have def directions times def directions 2 times square. So the def right there is just the keyword to tell Python, hey, I'm going to start writing a function. So just expect a function name next. So that function name in this specific example is directions to times square. And then after square, you might notice I have parentheses and a colon. So those parentheses are basically just like it's part of the syntax of creating a function. They usually hold parameters, but in this case, I'm not giving it a parameter. You could just create a function that's empty. And then that colon is just like Python's way of defining a function, so there's no getting around that. So like I said, a function can store some of our lines of code so that we could reuse it in the future. That way we don't have to rewrite it multiple times. So say user 1 asked me how to get to times square. I would just create some print statements and then print it out so that the user can see it. Okay, well then 1 month later, another user 2, says, hey, I need to know how to get to times square. So in that case, I would have to write out those same print statements again and then output that to the user. But what if I don't want to write all that out multiple times across multiple months? Well, in that case, that's why we use functions. So we can save stuff inside of a function, and Python will, once Python accepts that function, once you give Python a function name and then stuff to execute, Python won't execute it immediately, it'll just save it. And then whenever you call that function, Python will then output whatever exists inside of that function. So in this case, I defined a function called directions times square. Inside of that function, I gave it 3 print statements. And those print statements are just like, they just carry strings, which are directions times square. So if I run this code, as I told you, hold on. Okay, as I told you, just writing the function and then giving that function code to execute won't print it out to the user. I did mention that you have to call that function. So just for now, you're seeing the output. So pay attention to the very top. Let me just get my mouse. So just pay attention to this. So those are the directions that I included inside of my function. But how did Python output it? Well, Python outputted it by just reading one line of code. And that one line of code is what we call the call of a function. So when you call a function, all you do is really just repeat the name of the function. So if I gave that function the name of directions to times square, for me to tell Python to execute the code within that function, I just tell Python, hey, directions to times square. That's it. And then obviously the parentheses. You don't have to include the colon here. You don't have to include def. You just need the name and then the parentheses. That's it. So if the name of this function was directions, I would just write directions, parenthesis, open and close. if this function had parameters, I would then have to include arguments. But we're going to get to that later on. The fact that this function has no parameters means I can just call the function as is. I don't have to include any arguments. I just leave it blank. I just have to make sure I include the open and close parentheses, and that's it. Once you call this function, that's when you get the output of those three print statements that you saw before. I'll print it out again, or I'll run this code again so that you guys can see. So let me just get my mouse. So the moment I called this function, that's why it gave me these three print statements. That's at its very basic form, a function, writing a function, and calling a function. So now I'm going to get into indentation and why it matters when it comes to functions. So we already know that indentation does matter with, like, say, our for loop, our if statements, etc. Because we want whatever lines of code that we're giving for our for loop to exist or to be paired up with that for loop, right? So if I say loop through this list and then print out, say, like, one of the members of our list, like each time you're going through my list, print out member 1, member 2, etc. Kind of the same concepts being used here. So we could tell from the first example. Well, let's move on from this first example. Let's look at the second example. So I'm going to get rid of this. So the second example starts off with a print statement, and this print statement is outdented all the way, so that means it just stands by itself. So I'm referring to this print statement right here. So checking the weather for you. So if we use the logic that we've learned from week 1 through 3 with Python, Python reads code from top bottom from our program file. That must mean that this print statement, because it doesn't belong to anything, it just exists by itself, that must mean that this print statement will execute first. Okay, well, Python's going to execute this and output it because print statements output to the user. So the first thing the user is going to see is checking the weather for you. And actually, it's supposed to be you, not your. Okay, next thing we see is the def keyword. So the def keyword immediately tells me we're talking about a function here. The programmer created a function, and this function is going to store stuff inside of it. Okay, well, this function looks like the name of this function is weather check. And this function doesn't have any parameters, so I don't have to worry about that yet. It does look like it stores two print statements. The first print statement says, looks great outside, enjoy your trip. The second print statement is false alarm, the weather changed, there is a thunderstorm approaching, cancel your plans and stay inside. Okay, well, this function stores two print statements. Okay. The third thing I see is the function call, and I know it's the function call because it just says weather check, open and close parenthesis. So when this code executes, if we're just looking at this right here, we're not worrying about anything else, so let me comment out everything else after the fact, that way you guys don't get confused. Okay. If we're just looking at this piece of code right here, how do you think it's going to execute? Well, obviously we know that first print statement of checking the weather for you goes first. That's going to be the first thing the user sees. The second thing the user is going to see is, looks great outside, enjoy your trip. Now, is it because it's the second line the second print statement that we see in our code? Not necessarily, because remember, this function is not going to print anything out when Python reads it. So, like, when Python finishes reading this first print statement and then moves on to this function call, or this function definition, it's going to read the function of weather check. It's going to say, okay, this function stores two print statements, but it's not going to print them out immediately. It's only going to print them out when the function gets called right here. So yes, the order of this code is going to be checking the weather for you, looks great outside, enjoy your trip, false alarm, the weather changed. So ideally, that's how you would want the code to run, because it makes sense logically. They're checking the weather for you. They say it looks good, but then they say, oh, wait, a thunderstorm's coming, cancel your plans. Okay, but what happens when I move this print statement of false alarm all the way outside of the function? So now if we were to read this, it would be checking the weather for you would print out first. The second thing would be Python reads this print state or this function call or this function definition of weather check, saves it in memory, but it doesn't print it out. Then goes to the third print statement and says false alarm, the weather change. It will print this out because it doesn't exist inside of the function. It's just a standalone print statement. And then the function call of weather check will then execute whatever exists inside of the function of weather check, which is that print statement of looks great outside, enjoy your trip. So I'm going to execute this code, and you guys are going to see that it doesn't really make sense. So it says checking the weather for you, false alarm. So false alarm from what? Because it never gave us an initial weather. It never gave us an initial weather forecast. It just told us they're going to check the weather for us. So it can't really be false alarm yet. So we want this looks great outside, enjoy your trip to execute first. Not first, but second. So it should be checking the weather for you, looks great outside, and then we want the false alarm. So in order to do that, let's go back to our code. We want to make sure that this print statement of false alarm exists inside of our function. That way it gets executed in top-bottom order, meaning like when this function call does execute, when weather check does get read by Python, it's going to execute this function from top-bottom as well. So it's going to print out this first print statement and then the second print statement. So I did say a lot there, but I do want you guys to understand when you guys are writing your functions that indentation does matter, order does matter, so that your code makes sense to the user. So that's kind of it for indentation. So let's move on to parameters and arguments. I did kind of mention this as I was talking about the last two examples, but now you guys are going to see it firsthand. So let's look at this example. I commented out everything else. So we have another function because I see the keyword of def. So it says generate trip instructions. And then instead of as opposed to the previous examples where our parentheses were empty, there was nothing inside of it. In this case, our parentheses does have something inside of it, and the word location is what's inside of it. So yeah, you might be thinking, well, okay, if he's putting location inside of there, that must mean, just using the logic from week 1 through 3, he's either referring to a variable or he's referring to a string, and he just forgot the quotation marks. Well, in this case, I'm not referring to a string, and I'm not really referring to a variable either. Parameters in Python are kind of like placeholders. So think of them as sort of the dummy variable from the for loop. They don't have to be defined prior, so you can't. Typically, when we think of a variable, we think of actually telling Python, hey, I'm creating a variable called location, and inside of that variable, I'm going to give it a value of NYC, like a string, NYC for New York City. But in this case, the variable of location, or the parameter of location, was never defined prior. It's just immediately being used here, and Python's not giving me any errors despite me just throwing location out there. That's because the parameter, like I said, is just kind of a placeholder that's used inside of your function. So the parameter is the placeholder, and then the argument is the thing that's actually being passed through that placeholder, but I'm going to get to that. So for now, just know that I have a function called generate trip instructions, and I have one parameter called location. So let's look inside of this function. So inside of this function, I have two print statements. The first print statement says, looks like you're planning a trip to visit, and then that's the end of the string, and then I have the plus operator. We know the plus operator in this case is to join two strings together. It's either to join two strings together or to join two, or to be used as the arithmetic plus of adding two values together, but in this case, obviously, I'm not adding two values. I'm adding two strings. So I'm saying looks like you're planning planning a trip to visit, and then plus, and then location. And remember, location is my parameter, and it's not giving me an error because Python's reading location as not really having a data type yet. It's just a placeholder, so it's not going to return an error and say, oh well, location is not a string data type. location doesn't really have a data type yet, it's because it's a placeholder. Same thing for that second print statement. I'm trying to join those two with the plus operator, but Python's not giving me an error yet. So let's look at the function call. So the function call says generate trip instructions, and then inside of it, like before in the previous examples, I just did open close parenthesis. I never put anything inside of it. But in this case, I did. And in this case, I put a string of Grand Central Station. So this is not a parameter. The Grand Central Station is not a parameter. In this case, it's a argument. So when you're creating the initial function and then putting something inside of its parentheses, that's always going to be a parameter. But when you call that function and then you put something inside of those parentheses, that's always going to be referred to as an argument. The argument takes the place of the parameter when that function executes. But the parameter holds the spot inside when you're creating the function, so that anything that the coder decides to pass through that function could be passed through it. So knowing that when this function executes, since I'm calling the function, that means Python's going to read the function and actually execute what exists inside of the function. What do you think's going to actually happen here? Well, I'll actually run this code so that you guys can see. So what actually happens here is Python's going to print out the two print statements. Looks like you were planning a trip to visit Grand Central Station. So at location, that parameter of location was replaced with Grand Central Station, which was my argument. So hopefully that makes sense. The argument takes the place of the parameter, but we don't know what the argument is until the function gets called. So when we're writing the function, we just use placeholders. And the reason we do that, we don't just put Grand Central Station immediately, is because, say you want your code to be flexible. What if the user goes to Grand Central Station one day, but then the user ends up going to the Eiffel Tower the next day? For that, all we would have to do is change the argument we're passing through. We never have to change the parameter itself, because the parameter is very flexible. It will accept any string that we want it to accept. In this case, it's a string. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So at its basic core, that's a parameter, and that is a argument. So that's that. So let's move on to multiple parameters. So you can have more than one parameter. So let me take that out. In your function, you can have more than one parameter. You can have more than one argument. So for now, just know that if I have... Well, let's read this code. I don't want to confuse you guys yet, because there are exceptions. So that's why I'm debating on whether or not what to tell you. But let's take it step by step. For now, multiple parameters. So we have the function of calculate expenses, and I know it's a function because it starts with the keyword of def. And then inside of my parentheses, I have what looks like 4 parameters. And I know that they're 4 parameters because they're all separated by commas. So if you have more than one parameter, all you have to do is separate them with a comma. So my first parameter is plane ticket price, then the second parameter is car rental rate, the third parameter is hotel rate, and then the fourth parameter is trip time. Okay, well, if parameters are placeholders and they're not actually variables, then why am I using the parameters inside of my function, such as in this example? So if I look at the contents of this function, I see car rental total, which is, it's not actually a parameter that I've included. It's a whole new variable. It's a brand new variable that so this car rental total it's a regular variable, but we call this a local variable. It's a local variable as far as it only exists inside of this function. If I were to refer to it outside of this function, Python would return an error. Because anytime we define a brand new variable inside of a function specifically, such as in this example right here, car rental total, and then I'm equating a value, that means it can only be used inside of that function. Now, what happens if I were to create car rental total, and then assign it a value of, say, 0 outside of the function. So in this case, if I were to do it like that, that would be called a global variable because it exists outside of a function. It can be used anywhere inside of that program file, this specific program file. So yeah, global variables are a lot more flexible and more preferred than local variables, but there are cases where you would use a local variable, so I just want to mention that really quick. So yeah, we have 4 parameters, and then we have this brand new local variable called car rental total, and I'm assigning car rental total a value of car rental rate times trip time. So why am I being allowed to use my parameters and multiply them? Well, because remember, these parameters, while they're not true variables, they're placeholders, I can still use them in calculations, because remember, they're placeholders for actual values that are going to be passed in later on. So I could just say, hey, this placeholder times this placeholder is going to equal something later on. I just don't know what numbers I'm going to calculate with, but for now, just know that I do want these two placeholders to eventually be multiplied against each other. So that's what's happening here. It's perfectly valid to do that. So yeah, car rental total, a brand new variable is being assigned a value of car rental rate times trip time, and then the second variable, hotel total. This is another local variable. I'm assigning it the value of hotel rate times trip time minus 10. And then I'm printing out car rental total plus hotel total plus plane ticket price. So there's a bunch of stuff happening here, but it's really just all basic arithmetic, and arithmetic with placeholders. So just like how you would do stuff in like your math class where you do like a plus b equals c, a plus b and c are all like placeholders for actual values maybe. In this case, plane ticket price, car rental rate, think of those as a, b, and c. They're placeholders, and you can do a times b minus 10. In math, obviously, maybe it'd be a little bit different, but here it's kind of the same. I'm just trying to bridge the logic. It's obviously not one-to-one, but it's as close as I can compare it to. So let's look at the function call. So the function calls calculate expenses. So that hasn't changed the way we call function, but inside of it, as opposed to just being empty parentheses or one argument, now we have 4 arguments. And the reason we have 4 arguments is because we have 4 parameters. So if I have 4 parameters, I must have 4 arguments. If I have 4 arguments, that must mean that there's 4 parameters. It's a one-to-one replacement. So that first parameter of plane ticket price will be replaced with my first argument of 200. My second parameter of car rental rate will be replaced with my second argument of 100, and so forth. So it's always a one-to-one, and it goes in order. So if I execute this code, obviously it's going to do a lot of math. What actually gets printed out, the reason you only see one number of 1190 is because, remember, our code only printed out car rental total plus hotel total plus plane ticket price. So it took all of those numbers, added them together, and just gave us one number. So that's basically what it was doing. Obviously, if you wanted to do the math just to double check, you could. It's right there. You can pause the video. I'm going to move on. So that is how you handle multiple parameters. So for now, just know if you include, say, 2 parameters, you must have 2 arguments. If you include 3 parameters, you must have 3 arguments, and so forth. So there's a couple different ways of formatting your arguments in Python. There's positional arguments, there's keyword arguments, and there's default arguments. So thus far, I've showed you guys positional arguments. So if we looked at that previous example of multiple parameters, where we had 4 parameters and we had 4 arguments, and each one took the place, like the first parameter was replaced with the first argument, and second parameter with the second argument. That's the one-to-one replacement of positional arguments. So you guys have already done positional arguments. I showed you the example of that. So I'm not going to repeat, show you another example. You guys already saw that. So I'm going to get into keyword arguments. So keyword arguments are not one-to-one replacements, as you'll see. So let me just comment out the rest of this. Okay, so keyword arguments. So we see the function of my function, and I know this because it's prefaced with the keyword of def. And then we see three parameters. The first parameter is child3, the second parameter is child2, and then the third parameter is child1. And the reason I named it that is to show you that I kind of mixed the order of those parameters. Ideally, it would be child1, child2, and child3. But I didn't feel like doing that. I felt like doing, hey, child3, child2, child1. Opposite order. Okay, well, this function holds one print statement. It just says the youngest child is plus child3. Okay, well, when I call this function, I'm calling it, and it looks a little bit different than the previous examples that you guys have seen thus far. So it says my function, open parenthesis, and then it says child1 equals Emily. Now, hold on. So if I'm using the logic from the previous examples, it was always a one-to-one comparison. So the first parameter should take the first argument. But the argument that I'm passing says child1 equals Emily. But child1, in my actual function definition, is in the third place. It's not in the first place. Well, with keyword arguments, when we pass arguments into our function, or into the function call, we're telling Python what value is associated with each parameter. So we're specifically telling Python, hey, the value of Emily belongs to the parameter of child1. The value of Tobias belongs to the value of the parameter of child2. So it's kind of like a you can't mess this up to Python. We're telling it this matches up with that, so it doesn't matter the order in which I define my parameters in the original function definition, because in the function call, I'm telling Python, hey, this belongs to this belongs to this, and this belongs to this. So it doesn't matter the order. You're specifically telling Python, hey, this belongs to this. So that's referred to as keyword arguments. I'm not going to run this code. Yeah, sure, I'll run it. It doesn't hurt. So I'll run it. Yeah, so the youngest child is Matt. So because it printed out child3 and the value of child3 is Matt. So that's an example of keyword arguments. It's fairly simple. You can't really mess this up. Say like if you mess up the order of the parameters, and then it's just another way of doing it. Either way is fine. People use both ways when calling functions and creating functions. It's really up to preference at that point. And then the third example is the default arguments. So the default arguments is kind of like if you forget to pass an argument. So like you have the parameter, but say like when you're calling the function, you forget to pass an argument for that parameter. That's where default arguments come into play. So a default argument is a little bit different in the way you structure it. So you have def, my function, and then you have the parentheses. But inside of the parentheses, notice that I'm not only giving it a parameter, which is country. So country is my parameter, but I'm also saying country has a value of Norway. So Norway is the string, and typically I would include Norway as my argument. But in this case, I'm just straight up telling Python, hey, this is the function, my function, and I'm telling you this is my parameter, and this parameter has a value of Norway. So why would I do that? Well, you'll see. So this print statement says I am from, then plus, and then the parameter of country. So when I run this this first function call of my function Sweden, what do you think happens here? Do you think Python's going to print out I am from Sweden or I am from Norway? So I'm not going to run this code. I'm just going to tell you. Python will execute this first function call as I am from Sweden. So Sweden takes precedence over Norway because Norway is referred to as the default. So it's like the failsafe. So because I passed an argument, Norway gets ignored. So if I look at the second function call of my function India, India will be printed out to the user. So it's going to be I am from India. It's not going to be I am from Norway because I passed an argument. But now let's look at this third example of my function, but I didn't pass an argument here. So because I didn't pass an argument, that's when the failsafe or the default argument gets used. So in this case, what's going to be printed out to the user is I am from Norway because I didn't include an argument, so nothing can kind of like supersede that default argument or that failsafe argument. So default arguments are really just like failsafe. So like if you kind of like expect your coworker to forget to include an argument when calling your function, just include a default argument. That way the code doesn't error out. So that's why you would use that. So that's kind of it for default arguments. So let's see, what else do we have? Okay, we're almost done. And we're kind of like 30 minutes in, so it's a pretty good time. So now let's get into, well, I don't have an example here for you, but the difference between a built-in function and a user-defined function. So a built-in function is something like this. So it's like a len. We've used len in the past. Range, we've used range quite a bit. str, we've used str. Int, and then pow. So those are all examples of built-in functions in Python. They're functions that are kind of like already created for you. They serve a purpose. They do something with whatever you put inside of their parentheses or their parentheses. Those are built-in functions. What is a user-defined function? Well, a user-defined function is anything we've just covered this past 30 minutes. All those functions, those def, weather check, and so forth, all of those were user-defined functions because we created them ourselves. We named them, we put stuff inside of them for Python to execute. Those are referred to as user-defined functions. So that's it. I just want you guys to know the difference between the two. Okay, so variable access, we have kind of gone over this a little bit as far as like the difference between a global variable and a local variable. But I'm going to go over it again, just so that you guys can really, so I can hammer in the concept. So yeah, we only have two more things to go over. So variable access and returns. So variable access. So we have the variable, the global variable of budget. And I know it's a global variable because it's just a standalone line. It doesn't pertain to any specific function or for loop or any of that. It's just like it's outdented all the way to the left, which means it stands by itself. It's a global variable. It can be used anywhere inside of that inside of this program file. So I have the global variable of budget, and I gave it a value of 1,000. So then I have a function, and this function, I know it's a function because it has the keyword of def. This function is called trip welcome. And then inside of this function, I have what's called a default argument. And I know it's a default argument because it has the parameter and then it has a value associated with that parameter of California. Okay. So inside of this function, I have two print statements. The first print statement says, looks like you're going to, and then I'm saying plus destination. So destination is that parameter from the function of trip welcome. Okay, that's perfectly fine. I've seen that before. So the second print statement says your budget for this trip is plus str. And the reason I'm doing str is because I have this plus. So plus can only join two strings together. So on the left hand, we have this string, so that's fine. But on the right hand, I have budget. And I know budget was created beforehand. Budget was assigned a integer value of 1,000. So how do I combine an integer and a string together? Well, I could have just used the comma as you guys have been doing in the previous homework assignments that you guys have been doing. But you could also do plus str. I know some of you guys were doing that, and I told you don't do that. In this case, I'm doing it. I'm breaking my own rule. Either one works, really. But that's what str is doing there. And I'm saying plus budget. And the reason I could do plus budget, aside from like including the str, is because budget is a global variable. It can be used anywhere inside the program file, including inside of specific functions. So Now let's go to the next line of code where it says print budget. So I'm printing 1,000. Okay. This next thing I'm printing out is trip welcome. So it's not really printing anything out. I'm calling the function of trip welcome, which is going to print out these two print statements. So really, I'm having three things printed out to the console here. So if I press start, I should have 3 lines of code that get printed out to the user. Hold on, let me just get my... Okay, yeah. So you get 1,000. You get, looks like you're going to California. Your budget for this trip is 1,000. So yeah, that's kind of like explaining the concept of a global variable. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's get into returns. So returns is the very last thing I want to cover in this video. Let me get rid of this. Well, at least, yeah, because after this I'm going to go over the homework assignment. So let's look at the very first line. It says current budget equals 3,500.75. Okay, so that value is an integer value, so just keep that in mind. So let's look at the function. So the function says def print remaining budget. So that's the name of my function, and I'm passing one parameter, and that parameter is budget. Okay, so this function has one print statement inside of it that says your remaining budget is, and then I say plus and then budget, or str budget. So same thing as the previous example. I could have just put comma and then budget, but I just felt like doing the plus str budget to make budget, which was originally an integer value, into a string value. It would just be like quotation mark 3,500.75. I'm just doing that so I can combine two strings because I can't do a string and an integer value. But for you guys, keep doing the comma for your homework assignments. I'm doing this for the example. So let's look at this print statement. So this print statement of remaining budget, actually it's not a print statement, my fault. I saw print. So this function call of print remaining budget, I'm passing one argument inside of it. And that argument is that global variable of current budget. So my argument is the 3,500.75. So what happens when I include that argument inside of this function? Well, the print statement's going to actually read your remaining budget is 3,500.75 because remember, the parameter of budget gets replaced by the argument, and that argument is this global variable of current budget, which has the value of 3,500.75. Okay, that's that. Well, let's look at this next global variable. This next global variable is sure expense equals the value of 9. Okay, well, the second function of def deduct expense has two parameters. The first parameter is budget, which we saw in the previous function, and then the second parameter is expense, which is a brand new parameter that solely exists for this function. So this function is, instead of printing something out, as we've seen in previous examples, it's returning something. So what does it mean to return something inside of a function? That just means do a calculation, or like take numbers and add, subtract, multiply, take to the power of something, and then save it. Save it within the function, so that I can use that the result of that calculation for later use. That's what return really means, to save within Python. So the next thing we see is this other global variable that says new budget after shirt. And then we're giving it a value of deduct expense. And deduct expense is the function name of this function right here. So I'm saying new budget after shirt, which is a brand new global variable, give it the value of a function. And that function, I'm saying, because I'm not just giving it the value of a function, I'm giving it the value of the function call. And this is kind of important because you're going to see this later on in the Module Lab Assessment 4, where we can create new variables or use variables from that we've previously used and give it a value of a function call and pass new arguments into it. So notice that these are not the same parameters that we included originally. These are brand new arguments. So the first argument is current budget, which is from up here, from this global variable of current budget. And then the second argument is shirt expense, which is from the second global variable of shirt expense right here. So what's actually happening here is new budget after shirt, this brand new global variable that I created, is really, whenever I call that new variable, it's calling the function call of deduct expense, which is returning budget minus expense. So the value associated with the function of deduct expense is really, let's see, budget, which is um, 3,500, 3,500.75 minus 9, which if we run this, it should give us 3491. Yeah. So, yeah, I had to think about that because, like I told you guys, I'm not very good at math. But our original value was 3,575, and then minus 9, which is 3491.75. So, yeah, we bought a new shirt, we lost $9, and that's our new budget. That's pretty much it. So if this was a little bit confusing for you, just kind of like pause the video, run the code yourself, and just kind of like try to slowly understand each concept. Just know that this and this are global variables. This is one function. This is our second function. This is a function call, which is why we got the first initial budget of 3,575, and then this is not a function call. This is just creating a variable and giving a value to that variable. In this case, the value of that variable was a function call, but doesn't mean that the function gets called here. It just means that that function call gets saved inside of that variable. And then I actually call the function right here when I'm referring to the function of print remaining budget, and then I'm saying new budget after shirt. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's it for returns, and that's really all I have for you guys for this week for functions. So let me close this. Let's get this back up. So I'm going to close that. We're going to open up MindTap. So yeah, it kind of timed out on me. I had it open the whole time. All right. So let's kind of read through this together. There's quite a bit going on here for this homework assignment. Like I said, this is Module Lab Assessment 4, App Invest Return on Investment Function. I'm not going to go through the whole assignment with you guys. I'm just going to kind of go through parts of it and just kind of explain my logic on how you guys should approach it. But I'm going to read through the problem first. So it starts off by saying App Invest is a mobile application that helps people save money and safely invest in a varied portfolio of investment vehicles. The app has helped thousands of people to accomplish their financial goals. To invest money in the app is simple. You open an account with at least $1,000 and you're ready to go. There are a number of investment apps currently available on the market, but App Invest excels in some areas and offers a better service than its competitors. Some advantages of the app include setting a short-term financial goal to be achieved, as well as immediate access to the user's funds. The company is planning on releasing a new feature that will enable investors to increase gains depending on the amount invested. In other words, the more money you put into the app, the greater your rate of return. You have been tasked with adding this functionality. Initially, the investment engine has to be extended to allow for investors to increase their gain margin if they invest more money in the app. So the company has agreed internally that 1 million is a good starting point to trigger the increase of the gain margin. If the invested amount surpasses 1 million, then the gain margin will be increased by 1%. So that's pretty important right there. So every time we invest 1 million, so like 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, we increase the gain margin by 1%. So just keep that in mind. Similarly, if the invested amount is $5 million, then the gain margin will be increased to 5% and so on, limited to a maximum of 100%. Okay, so read through that a couple times. I know it's like a little bit complicated if you're not like super interested in finance and stuff like that and investments, but just try to get a general concept of that, and then after that move on to the second page. So to complete this assignment, you don't have to be a math wizard, because obviously I'm not a math wizard. You just have to have a solid foundation of reading what they want you to do and then using the skills that you guys have learned with functions to complete those assignments. You don't need to really worry about the math. I completed this without even thinking about the math too much. Really just core good coding can get you through this assignment. So let's look at what they're asking for, because that's the important thing. Paying attention to what they're asking for and giving them what they're asking for, and not worrying about all the calculation, because at the end of the day, the program will do the calculation for you. And on top of that, they actually gave you quite a bit of code to use to save you like the headache of having to decide, oh, how do I name my function? How do I do this? They kind of like give you some parts, so you just have to fill in the other missing parts. So that's what we're going to do here. So let's read what they want. So the standard gain margin is 0.1% per month, plus 1% each time the amount surpasses increments of $1 million, as we saw on the previous page. So for example, if the amount invested is $5 million, then the gain margin would be 0.1% plus 5% equals 5.1%. So for this assessment, you will write a function that for a given invested amount will return that amount plus the calculated investment gains. So if the given amount is greater than 1 million threshold, the app will need to increase the rate of the return 1% for every $1 million invested plus the original rate of 0.1%. Finally, you will implement the functionality to estimate, forecast the return on investment of the time period. So that's going to be in the next page, so you don't have to worry about that right now. So in order for you to start this project, we will provide a function template, which they have, that can be followed to solve this challenge. The code block below is a sample that this project could, a sample way that this project could be structured. So don't worry about all of this. They kind of already give it to you right here, so you don't have to like read through this. It's already right here for you. So let's go on to page 3. So page 3 is really where the requirements come for this assignment. The page 1 and 2 is really just like explaining what's happening, what the math is actually going to do. But for you as the coder, you don't really have to worry too much about the math. You just have to worry about writing the correct lines of code. So the first thing they want us to do is to create a user-defined function called calculate gains. So they already do that for you. So that's one thing that's already done. Great. So this function, which receives the amount desired to be invested. So amount invested equals 0.0. Okay, that's kind of done for you too. Because remember, amount invested equals 0.0. So that itself, if you guys are like remembering from what I just taught you in Visual Studio, that's a default argument, because amount invested is the parameter equals, I'm giving that parameter a value of 0.0. That's a default value. So like when I call this function and I don't give it a argument, it would default to 0.0. But that's only if I don't give it an argument. If I do give it an argument, then amount invested would have a totally different value. So I'm just kind of like bridging the gap between what I just taught you and what's being expected, or the code that's being used here. So that's kind of why I want to do this after I explain everything. Okay, so outside this function, create a global variable. So remember, global variables don't exist inside of a function, they exist outside. So this global variable, and they even highlight the name of the global variable they want you to create. They want you to name it multiplier amount. That would be accessible at any point in the code to store the multiplier amount, which will be the amount that will trigger the increase on the gain margin. In this case, the invested amount is greater than this value. In our case, the amount is set to 1 million. Okay, so not only did they give you the global variable name, they also gave you the value, which is 1 million. So this whole paragraph, literally all you have to do for this whole paragraph is create the global variable of multiplier amount, set it to an integer value of 1 million, and that's it. And then you've completed literally the first part of this assignment, or not the first part, this first paragraph. Now, this first paragraph, they try to confuse you with all these fancy words, but pay attention to what they're actually asking. So if I, and like right here where they commented global variable, just right underneath it, just write the global variable. So, whoops, multiplier underscore amount, write it the same way you see it here. The same way it's highlighted blue here, write it the same exact way. It might not be highlighted blue in our .py file, but it's okay. So set it equal to 1 million. So that's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that's 1 million. Great. So let's look at the second paragraph. Let's see what they're asking there. So the second paragraph says, inside your function, so inside of the function of def calculate gains, create a variable to store the gain margin, which is 0.1 by default. So before we get into like anything else, anytime you see like a comma or a period, just stop right there, look at what they're asking, and try to write what they're asking. Once you start like trying to do too much or like put stuff that doesn't belong there, that's where you end up running into problems where your code might run, but then you have to like change one thing to like to I don't know. Don't overcomplicate things. Just take it step by step. Always sentence by sentence, comma by comma. That's how you should take any programming problem, whether it's Python, whether it's C++, Java, whatever. So they want me to create a variable that stores the gain margin. So what should I name this variable? If it's going to store the gain margin, should I not just name this like gain margin? Yeah. Okay. Well, where should I put it in my code? Well, they kind of like give you these comments where they kind of like guide you, like, hey, put this here, put that there. So I'm gonna kind of put it under base amount gain margin because that's really the only comment that I see here that makes sense to put it under. But before I do that, I do have to get rid of this overarching comment. I can do that. So yeah, because I do want this if statement. So take away the 3 quotation marks here. That way I can get access to this if statement because they do want you to use that if statement, and it is kind of like necessary. So right under base amount gain margin, that's where I'm going to create my variable of gain margin. So it's going to be gain margin, and I'm going to equal it to 0.1%. But if I want that percent, I can't just write 0.1 because remember, it's 0.1%. But if I want to turn 0.1% into a decimal, I have to, change it to a decimal, which is multiplying that by, I believe it's multiplying it by 100. Never mind. It's dividing it by 100. Multiplying it is to get it back into a percentage. Dividing it is to get it into a decimal. Like I said, I'm not good at math. So divide 0.1 by 100 to get it into a decimal, and that's what we're going to give this value for the gain margin. So if I do that, let me get my calculator out. So 0.1 divided by 100. You guys don't see my calculator, but it's there. So 0.001 is actually what I'm going to assign the value of gain margin. 0.001. So that satisfies that first sentence. So the second sentence, which says also create variables for total gains and total amount. Okay, well, they already give me the name, so I'm just going to write it exactly how I see it. Total gains and total amount. And they want us to set default values to 0. So we're going to give both of these variables the value of 0. Great. Okay, so that's the second sentence. So after these declarations, the first thing to check is whether the amount invested is greater than 1,000, which is the minimum application value to start using the app. So that's where this if statement comes in. Excuse me. So that's where this if statement comes in, where it says if amount invested is greater than 1,000. So they wrote it for you. You just have to take out the multi-line comment, which was the 3 quotation marks, and then put a single line comment in front of calculating the return gains of an investment. That way you don't get any errors in your code. So this final if statement that they wrote for you satisfies that last requirement. So at this point, we've finished 2 paragraphs of this assignment. So there's only 2 more for the first part of the assignment. There's only 2 parts to this assignment. So you're basically halfway there with the first part. So this third part where it says, check if the amount is greater than the multiplier value 1 million. If it is greater, then update the gain margin variable with the new gain margin and add the estimated amount to the original amount. Otherwise, just multiply the values to obtain the return on investment for the given amount. So there's a lot going on there. So let's take it step by step. Okay. So the very first thing they're asking for is to see if the amount is check if the amount is greater than the multiplier value 1 million. So we do have to kind of like create an if statement that will check to see that. So we're going to write this if statement inside of the if statement of if amount is greater than 1,000. So yeah, it's a nested if statement. I'm not sure if you guys have done that yet, but if not, then this is your first time. So we're going to do if an amount invested is greater than, and then we're going to do multiplier amount. Because remember, they're asking to see if the amount is greater than the multiplier amount, which is up here, 1 million. So we're just going to do multiplier amount, then we're going to do colon. Okay, so if it is greater, then update the gain margin variable with the new gain margin. So let's kind of do that. Hold on, I'm like going through a bunch of windows. Okay, so we're going to update the gain margin by the multiplier mod. So I'm going to write it underneath here because that's like the closest thing as far as like a comment to place my code in. So it is really nice that they did give us like these little kind of like hints on where to write our code. Sorry. So let's do, they want us to update the gain margin variable with the new gain margin and add the estimated amount to the original amount. So the way I'll do it is I'll do like gain margin, because we're updating gain margin, and then I'm going to do multiplier divided by 100. And you might be like, okay, where does this mult come from? Well, this mult, you'll see. I'm going to create that in a second. Mults divided by 100, and I'm going to do plus gain margin. And so where's this mult coming from? Well, it's actually going to come from here. So I'm going to do that. So it's going to be mult equals amount invested, and we'll do floor division of multiply amount. So this is really just saying, okay, well, if I invested, say, like 2 million, 2.5 million, right? Let's do 2.5 million. Remember, it's going to increase the multiplier, or the 1% every million that we put into it. So if I do 2.5 million, then if I want the multiplier amount, or the multiplier, so like really how many percentages are we talking about here, then I have to take the amount invested, which is 2.5 million, divided by the multiplier amount, which is 1 million, and then in that case I would get 2.5, or yeah, 2.5. But because I'm using floor division, because it only, remember, it doesn't care if it's 2.5 million, it has to be an even million. That's why I use floor division. Floor division rounds down. So the mult would really be equal to 2 million, or 2 here, because it would be 2.5 million floor divide by 1 million would be 2. So if I go to gain margin, so now I'm taking 2 divided by 100 plus gain margin, which is 0.001. So yeah, you would have to kind of go back to the previous explanation of why, like how the whole investment app works to kind of like understand these 2 lines. But just know that you do need this variable right here of mult, and then to update the gain margin, you would do that. So where were we? Otherwise, just multiply the values to obtain the return on investment for the given amount. Okay, so I can't see my screen. Okay, okay, so to calculate the amount of gains, so otherwise just multiply the values to obtain the return on investment for the given amount. That would just be total gains equals amount invested. We're multiplying this by gains margin. So this is really just going to represent taking the multiplier amount, or the multiplier here, and the percentage of gain margin here. This is going to say, okay, well, if you invested 2.5, then we're going to do times, and then whatever gains margin was when we updated it. And that's going to be like however much we gained with that interest. So the calculate, or well, actually, that's the third paragraph. So let's move on to the fourth paragraph. Finally, you need to return. Finally, you need to return the total gains amount, the amount invested, updated with the return on investment added to it, as well as the gain margin. But what about the calculate the total amount plus the gain margin? I think they're talking about this final comment, but we need to fill out this one comment right here where it says calculate the total amount plus the gain margin. So for that, we can do kind of like total amount equals amount invested plus total gains. Because, yeah, we got total gains, which could be like whatever number, but now we have to add it to whatever the 2.5 say we invested. So 2.5 plus however much we gained off that interest, and that's going to be the total amount. So this is whatever that interest was of total gains, total amount, and then gain margin is something else. So now what they want us to do is they want us to return the total gains amount, which is this variable, the amount invested updated with the return on investment added to it, which is our total amount, as well as the gain margin, which is right here. The ordering is important for testing purposes. To test your function, enter the following amount, so 2 million. So they do want us to do, what was the order? Do they have an example here? So yeah, they do have an example here. So from what I can tell from this example output, it looks like if the initial amount was 2 million, so this is probably right here our variable of total amount, because it looks like 2 million plus 42,000. So this 42,000, I'm assuming, is the total gains. And then this decimal right here has to be the gain margin. Because it's taken from the multiplier. So if 2 million was invested here, so mult would be equal to 2, and then mult divided by 100. Let's do mult divided by 100 really quick. Let me get my calculator out. So if it's 2 divided by 100, it's 0.02, and then plus 0.001, which is gain margin. So 0.021. So yeah, 0.021 is the gain margin. Yeah, so if you do all this math, you could kind of find out the order that they're expecting, because remember, they said order is important here. So the way you should order this is, we do have to return this. So down here, remember from our functions, we can return, and all of this, everything I'm writing inside of here, is inside of my function. So just remember, like, notice the indentation, it's all indented at one level, so it exists inside of the function of calculate gains. So I can return inside of this function, so I can do return, and they wanted us to return, but in the specific order that makes sense, because if you don't return it in the specific order, then it's going to return an error. So return total, what was it? Total gains, total amount, and then gain margin. Okay. Was that? Turn gains, full amounts. Well, it's not necessarily the way it's gonna look. Let's go with this for now. Yeah, let's just go with this for now. And then the final thing that they want us to do is to test your function, enter the following amount, 2 million. Return the total gains, total updated amount, and gain margin. So yeah, this technically is the order that they're asking for here. But down here, if you notice, for the output, it does come out a different way. Not going to worry too much about that. So we did all this stuff inside of this function. but it's not actually going to print anything out to us if we don't, like, so like right here. If I do Python 3 main.py, or not main.py, it'd be calculate underscore gains.py. Nothing happens because even though I'm doing all this calculation, I'm not printing anything out, so obviously nothing's going to happen. So I do need to print something out. So let's do print calculate gains, which is the name of the function. And then inside of that function, remember, I do have to pass a argument, and this argument, at least in this example, they wanted us to use 2 million. So let's use 2 million. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then one more. Okay, so let's do Python 3 calculate underscore gains.py, traceback error. Okay. So I do have to do amount invest equals. Okay. So now we can do Python 3 calculate gains.py, traceback error. Calculate gains, amount invested. 2 million is greater. Huh. Gains margin is not defined. Oh, you know what? Where did I write gains margin? Total gains. This. Okay. So it was gain margin, not gains margin. Okay. So that should fix it. So if I do Python 3 calculate gains.py. Yeah. Okay. So we do get our output. We get 4,200 or 42,000 as our gain or our total gains. We get this huge number as our total amount, 2 million, whatever, and then we get 0.021 as our gain margin. Okay, so that's good. So now if I do the check mark here, let's see if they give us full checks. Okay, I have 2 checks passed. So that's the first part of this assignment. It did take a little bit of just making sure everything was correct. So I did name one of my variables right here, gain margin as gains margin, and that's why it was giving me these errors. So I just took away the S, and because I initially declared it as gain margin, that's what I had to do. So for part 2, you're done with this file. This file, you don't have to touch it again. Now we move to the second file that they give us, which is calculate gains over time. So part 2 would be another functionality for this app is the ability to estimate the return on investment over a period of time. In order to implement this feature, you will have to update the investment calculator algorithm. The base function to calculate the return on investment from task 1 could be reutilized here to simplify your task. This feature will take into consideration a 12-month period by default. To calculate the total amount earned over a period of time, you will have to loop through the n months period, increase the amount for each period. The other rules from the previous task apply here as well. For example, if you invest $3 million on the first month and obtain a return of $93,000, then the amount to be invested in the second month is 3.93. But obviously, you only gain that additional 1% every million. So okay. So to summarize, they want us to loop over a period of 12 months to calculate the total for each period. They then want us to return the accumulated estimated value for a period of 12 months. They say, note that to calculate the accumulated value over a 12-month period, do not just multiply the gain every month by 12. In this case, the gain of every month is added to the original value, updating the amount to be invested. So like once we reach 4 million from 3 million, then that percentage goes from 3% or 3% to 4%. So they just say to keep that in mind when calculating over 12 months, that the amount invested after 1 month might increase that percentage. So they just say to keep that in mind. So the following base code is given for you in the file calculate gains over time. So we don't have to really pay attention to this because it's already on the right hand side. So yeah, let's see how we can do this. Alright, so I think the first thing, when dealing with multi-file problems, we want to make sure that if we create one file that has calculations that we want to use in a different file, we do have to import it into our existing program file. So if remember we finished that calculate gains.py file, we did all of that stuff that they asked us to do, and it did give us like gains for 1 month. Now we're working with another file that says calculate gains over time.py, and for this file, we want to use the same concepts from the original file, but over 12 months. So in this file, if we want to use the stuff we did in the previous file, we do have to import it. And so to import one file into another file in Python, we do have to use a certain syntax that would typically be covered in a later chapter, but I'm just going to give it to you guys right now. So just write it down. So it's from calculate gains. So I'm saying from the file of calculate gains.py. We don't have to include .py. We just say from calculate gains import. So I'm saying import. And in this case, you could say like import specific function or import specific whatever. I'm just going to say import everything. And to say import everything, you just use the star symbol. So import everything from the file of calculate gains, and the file being like the .py file. So everything from this file right here is being imported into this other file. And so that's pretty important to do first and foremost. I did create a single line comment for this first line of code, or it's not even code. They're just saying the following base code is given for you, so I just commented it out so that it doesn't ruin when I run this code, which it will if you don't comment that out. So basically, they don't really give you a whole lot of guidelines over here on the left-hand side, so I'm just going to use the guidelines that they give me with these little single line comments. So the first thing they tell me is call the base calculate gains function to estimate the gains for the first period. So we kind of already know that that previous calculate gains file calculates for 1 period, for 1 month. So in order for me to estimate the gains for the first period, all I really have to do is call that function. So we know how to call a function. We would just write calculate gains, and then like the parentheses and then stuff inside of it. But in this case, if I'm just going to do it, I'm going to do it like a little bit different. So you will kind of like be maybe like a little bit confused. So I'm going to do total gains, then I'm going to do total amount, then I'm going to do gain margin, and then I'm going to do equal to the function of calculate gains. And then inside of it, I will pass one argument, which will be amount invested. So this is basically just saying, hey, for the variable of total gains, for the variable of total amount, for the variable of gain margin, assign it the function of calculate gains, which exists in this other .py file. That's all I'm writing here. Yeah, it's like, oh, how would I know to write that? Well, that's why I say like this program's like a little bit harder. Obviously, you could just write calculate gains amount invested, but you might run into some other issues as far as like these other variables not really existing. Well, yeah, you might run into that. We'll try both ways. When we execute this code, we'll try both ways. That way you guys can see. So for the second comment, says calculate the first period before entering the loop. So this is relatively simple. All I'm just going to do is I'm going to create a new variable called new amount, and then I'm just going to give it a value of total amount. That's all I'm going to do. So I'm going to say like every time total amount. So like when this code runs for the first time, like for back here for calculate gains, when it ran that first time, it gave me the total amount of the first month. But what happens when I do use my for loop to have that amount execute for the second month? Where does that amount go? Well, I want that amount, that total amount, to go into the new variable of new amount. So new amount is basically going to store the total amount across 12 months. So that's what's happening here. I can't just kind of place it all in total amount because total amount just gets replaced every loop. So now it's saying loop through the specified period to calculate the gain of each month. L to period -1 because the first period gains is already calculated above. Okay, so here they just want us to create a for loop, so it'd be like for I in range. So we're going to do range here because we want range of 1 month to 12 months. So we're going to do 1, comma, and then we're going to do period. So why are we going to do period? Because remember, if we look at our function of calculate gains over time up here, period equals 12. So those are 12 months, but I'm starting at 1 and not 0 because 1 month was already calculated up here. When I called this function of new amount equals total amount. So when I call total amount, remember total amount has the value of the function of calculate gains from that other file. So the moment that total amount gets run or like executed, it's going to run that initial first month of calculating gains. So I don't need to mention it in my for loop because it's already done for me. So what's the next thing I have to do? So call the function to update the value based on the period inside the loop and the updated amount. So here they just same thing we did up here. Call the function. So I'm just gonna essentially just write what I wrote up there. Total amount gain margin equals calculate gains. But instead of writing amount invested up here, I'm going to write new amount. That's really the only change I'm doing here. Everything else is relatively the same. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So if I do Python 3 calculate gains over time.py. Oh, I forgot the colon for my for loop. Okay, Python 3, not main. So yeah, I just forgot a colon because remember I created a for loop here, but I just didn't put the colon. So calculate gains over time.py. Yeah, so it gives me, so it started at 2 million because remember 2 million was the start point. Right here. So amount invested was 2 million up here, and it was my default value. So if it was 2 million and across 12 months, this was the amount added every month, or at least the first month, and then this is the total after 12 months. So if you were to do like, say, well, actually, I'm not going to even get into the math. If there's someone here that's really good at math and they want to like calculate each month, like after 1 month, this was your total. After 2 months, maybe you get to, maybe after 3 months, you get to like 3 million, and then this percentage gets increased, and then like this would obviously get increased as well, and then like eventually you do end up at this number. But like I said, I'm not good at math. I'm not going to pretend to like know how it's calculating everything. I just write the code. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I at the beginning of this, I said I wasn't going to do everything. I ended up doing everything. But that's it. If you guys want, so now that you guys have step 1 and 2 done, well, actually, let's check to make sure 2 is actually completed correctly. Okay. There is this other part where it says make it your own. Now, this isn't graded automatically. It's like manually graded by myself. So if you guys do this, If you guys want to like practice this on your own, you guys can. Um, so like you guys could do it, and I can grade it for you. If you guys have questions on this specific section, you guys can obviously reach out to me on this specific section as well, because I do kind of feel bad that I did do everything for you on this homework assignment, but it was pretty hard, and there was times where I did have to like kind of like pause for a second, like think, like hold on, and the instructions, at least for the second part, were not as clear as I would have liked it to be. But it is what it is. So yeah, this video is like, let's see, like an hour 20, so about how long we typically have it. So I do want to end it here. So that is the end of week 4. For week 5, we will be going over a new topic, so do be prepared for that. I will be releasing week 5, 6, and 7's formula packet in the coming days, so if you guys have probably noticed that there is no formula packet for 5, 6, and 7 yet. It's just because I haven't uploaded them yet, so I will upload them in the coming days. So do look out for that. But yeah, this is week 4's video. I will see you guys in week 5's video.